Let us now take this a step further by considering some of the sociological arguments. We'll consider a number of different sociological thinkers, but let us start by thinking about the ideas of the great French sociologist Émile Durkheim. What Durkheim wanted to do was to develop a moral science. He wanted to discover the moral laws of society. He wanted to approach society in terms of its moral values and basis. It perhaps may come as no surprise then to learn that he was profoundly influenced by the ideas of Immanuel Kant. And it wasn't just the idea of the moral law that influenced Durkheim's sociological approach and his scientific study of the morality of society, but also the influence of Kant on his understandings of punishment. As we noted, Kant was somebody who defended punishment in terms of retribution and denunciation. And for Durkheim, the key justification of punishment in society was that of denunciation. Durkheim believed that punishment sent a moral message to society, that punishment denounced certain forms of immoral behaviour, and therefore they performed an important role in society in terms of maintaining social order and also shoring up various different forms of social cohesion and solidarities. Durkheim was one of the first people to recognise that crime was a social construction, i.e. that there wasn't such a thing as a criminal act which happened throughout the whole of human history, throughout the whole of eternity, an evil which we could pinpoint at various different points in terms of human history and indicate that this was always wrongful and problematic and harmful behaviour. Rather, Durkheim argued that what we understood as a crime, in the main, had to be understood within its social and historical and economic and political context. That therefore, the ideas of what was criminal and what was not criminal changed through history. They changed through time. For simplicity's sake, Durkheim ultimately was a contributor to the ideas around the sociology of deviance. And that is that deviance is something which was generated by societies, which deviated from laws and cultural norms and values. For Durkheim, those crimes or those forms of deviance were absolutely essential for a healthy functioning society. That there would be no human progress unless people deviated from the rules and the norms. Hence, for Durkheim, crime was normal. Crime was something, or his deviance was something which was absolutely essential for a healthy functioning society. But at the same time, Durkheim had a second conception of crime. And for Durkheim, these other crimes were not healthy. They were not a sign of social progress. They were not something that was essential for society, but actually was something that presented a threat to social cohesion, that presented a threat to the well-being of all people in a given society. These crimes were heinous acts. They were acts that were so outrageous that they shocked the conscience collective, that they shocked the well-being and morality and health of all people within a given society, that there were certain wrongdoings, there were certain shocking, heinous acts of criminal activity, which if they were not responded to, threatened the very existence of society itself. And for Durkheim, there needed to be a reaction to that. There needed to be a punishment which sent a reassuring moral message to society that not only was the harmfulness and wrongdoing of this given heinous criminal activity recognised, but that also that something was done to the people who'd perpetrated this given act and that they were morally condemned. Now, what was significant for Durkheim is the relationship between society and the form and kind of punishment that existed. Now, Durkheim very simply set up a historical binary of a primitive and an advanced society. A primitive society was a society which goes back many, many years, goes back many, many centuries, to the early dawn of human history, where people had very, very similar mindsets and had very, very similar identities. And this idea that social bonds were based on these ideas that people who we trust and the people that we bond with are very, very similar to us. They were also institutions which were grounded in religious belief. And indeed, the law itself was something that was enshrined and proposed to people through God. And therefore, when people ultimately broke the law, they were not only infringing the rule of man, they were infringing the rule of God. And therefore, to appease God, punishments had to be very, very extreme. Punishments had to be very, very physical in terms of the destruction of an individual. They had to be things like where people were drawn and quartered, where their bodies were thrown around different parts of a given community's physical boundaries. That people had to be cruelly tortured and punished because it was a way of actually sending a message to society that the harm and the illegality had been punished severely. But for Durkheim, as societies developed, they became less in need of such physical punishments. That as we move towards our modern societies which ultimately were grounded in the division of labour, we became more able to recognise the difference of other people and began to root our solidarities and sense of cohesion within diversity and difference. So whereas in the primitive society, morality was weak and brittle and therefore needed the punishment to be harsh and extreme to actually protect the social cohesion, as societies became rooted in difference, there was a greater flexibility to the moral cohesion of a given society, that societies were stronger, and therefore that the protective role of punishment was much less significant. And as societies evolved, the forms of dominant punishment evolved and they became more humane. So punishment is all about how well integrated a society is, how strong the bonds and connectedness are between individuals, how socially cohesive a given society is at a given time. In other words, for Durkheim, a moral society was a society which was strongly bonded and was able to recognise and ultimately to engage with difference. It wasn't so scared, it wasn't so rooted in fear, it wasn't so rooted in a sense that society could unravel with the first threat. Rather, it was a moral society which was strong. Now, as advanced societies move forward, Durkheim also differentiated between, in those modern societies, those societies which were stronger or weaker than others, and hence those societies which needed greater or lesser forms of punishment. Weak societies were those which were grounded in social inequalities, those which were grounded in social divisions. Strong societies were those which were much closer to equality, which were much closer to strong forms of social inclusion and cohesiveness. In the strong societies, where people were able to recognise difference, there was much less need to punish. So Durkheim ultimately talked about the evolution of punishment and the decrease in the actual utility of punishment, and that ultimately, for him, a moral society was an equal society which relied very little on punishment. A further point which is important for Durkheimian approaches to punishment are the similarities with another social thinker who was writing at a similar time. And this is the work of Peter Kropotkin. Both Kropotkin and Durkheim were influenced by the French social tradition, and therefore they held many assumptions in common about what was important in terms to study in French and other societies at that time. They both also were profoundly influenced by the insights of Immanuel Kant, and both wanted to develop a moral science of society. However, unlike Durkheim, Peter Kropotkin argued that the division of labour, rather than actually generating a sense of solidarity, was something which actually undermined consensus and community, and indeed was something which led to exclusionary ideas and logics rather than the ideas of inclusion and solidarity that Durkheim had advocated. And, most pertinently for us, whereas Durkheim thought that punishment was defendable in terms of shoring up social cohesion, for Peter Kropotkin, punishments, and in particular the prison, could never be defended. Taking a strong moral argument, Kropotkin argued that prisons were profoundly immoral and that they did not provide the sense of social defence and social cohesion that Durkheim had advocated.